You like.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Frontline Club. It's lovely to see so many of you here today. We're here today to launch the Middle East section, if you like, of the World Report 2019. Which, for those of you unfamiliar with the World Report, is a product we put out at Human Rights Watch every year, updating human rights trends around the world on all the countries on which we work, which is more than 90 countries around the world, as well as major thematic issues: women's rights, LGBT rights, children's rights, disability rights, and so much more. Our World Report was launched in Berlin last week, and today we're really here to unpack what's going on in the Middle East, to look at what happened in 2018 in terms of human rights, and to take a look forward to see what the trends are, what we can expect to happen across the Middle East over the next 12 months or so. The format today will be kind of short, sharp and dirty. We're going to have 5 of our Middle East experts give 5 super quick talks, a sort of a tour of the Middle East, a spin around the region on what happened last year, what they expect to see this year. We're going to have, that should take about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, 5 people, 5 topics. Then afterwards we're going to get chairs on stage, we'll all line up and you guys can fire questions at us and any of our experts on all of the topics that we've been chatting about. I'm delighted to say that we're broadcasting live right now on Al Jazeera and on the Facebook page of Human Rights Watch. So for those of you watching remotely, you can also put questions to us via our Facebook page, and we'll get those questions asked to our experts when they join us after the initial presentations. So to kick things off, I'm delighted to welcome onto stage our Middle East Director at Human Rights Watch, Sarah Lee Whitson.
Thank you. Hi everyone, we're here in London today. We're not here in Cairo, and we're not here in Dubai. We're not here in Manama, we're not here in Rabat, we're not here in one of the many capitals in which for many years we've launched our world reports from, because the Middle East has not just become more closed to civil society domestically, it has become more closed to civil society internationally. We're unable to have our world report release in many or most of the places where we've, over the past decade, launched our world reports from, because it's not only harder to get out of the Middle East, with thousands and thousands of people subject to arbitrary travel bans, stripping of their citizenships, their countries' virtual cages, particularly Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, where people just can't leave, where people in Gaza, the whole territory is a virtual cage for millions of people who do not have freedom of movement, and Yemen, where people are unable to even flee the war. But we also increasingly find ourselves unable to get in. And this is not just human rights organizations, but journalists, academics, even humanitarians find themselves increasingly unable to get on the ground to report and document the truth of what's happening. For that reason, it's even more important for us to show that this will not stop us from getting the truth out, and I hope it will redouble all of your efforts to keeping a spotlight and digging into the details of what's happening on the ground. Fortunately, we have new technologies available to us that makes it very possible to continue to keeping the focus on the Middle East as much as the governments in the region would rather that we look away. One of the dominant narratives in the region these days is the Sunni-Shia split, and we are all looking anxiously as the drumbeats of war against Iran are being promoted at this point in an effort, as the narrative goes, to curtail Iranian influence in the region. There was a funny little tweet by the IDF recently saying, "Why is Iran in Syria? Has it lost its way? It should be in Iran." But the Sunni-Shia split is only one narrative in the region, and we should also keep very, very focused on the less obvious narrative of the Sunni-Sunni wars, of the Sunni-Sunni split, as the monarchical, autocratic governments of the region are doing everything they can to quelch the last vestiges of democratic expression, particularly Islamist democratic expression in the region, particularly targeting the Muslim Brotherhood and its voices throughout the Middle East in order to curtail what they see as an existential threat against their monarchical, autocratic ways. but also all independent voices around the region who reflect voices of democracy and independent thinking. Those are the greatest targets in the Middle East today. Iran, of course, is very good at reminding us of the global campaign against it, the imminent possibility of war against it, the sanctions against it that has had a serious effect on the civilian population, including, for example, on access to medicine. But that is no cover for its own oppression and its own tyranny against its population, particularly its wide-scale arrests of protesters in the country, activists in the country. On the one hand, it is a positive thing, and we recognize that Iranians at least are able to protest. Teachers, minorities, others challenging oppression, corruption, inflation in the country, but the government is unable to resist the heavy hand of its oppression, using violence against protesters, jailing hundreds and thousands. My colleagues are going to be doing some of the deeper dive into what we see as the key themes today. But I also want us to focus on the one really, really good story, one really that is our hope and dream for the success of Tunisia, the only standing democracy to have emerged from the Arab uprisings. We know that the country faces tremendous challenges, terrorism, a stagnant economy, as well as some regression on advances like the truth and accountability efforts in the country. But there have been important progresses made, and we really have to encourage to keep a positive eye on the very, very diligent efforts that civil society is making to keep the successful experiment of democracy in Tunisia going. I was last here in October, as I see some familiar faces here, to speak at Jamal Khashoggi's memorial. And I am so happy and delighted that the international media community has made such a great effort to keeping us reminded of this gruesome murder and demanding accountability for his gruesome murder and not to let up on his case. And I hope that the continued focus on his case and the continued pressure that we know Saudi Arabia is feeling to deliver some modicum of justice for his murder is a sign of the power of your words, the power of our voices, and the power of keeping international pressure. But with that, I want to also urge you to keep a spotlight on some key cases that need our attention and need our support because they're not dead, but they are suffering. I want to start by recognizing Ahmed Mansour and Nabil Rajab here behind me, who are particularly close not only because they're my friends, but because they're part of the Human Rights Watch family. They're both members of the Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa Advisory Committee. They've both been jailed with extremely unfair prison terms, extreme prison terms, having exhausted all their legal appeals, mainly and really only because of their political expression. In Nabil's case, most recently because he criticized the war in Yemen, something I'm sure all of us here have done. It's just not right that he's imprisoned. In Ahmed's case, his imprisonment is because he tweeted about the unjust treatment and detention of some of his friends and fellow activists in the UAE. I wanted to urge you to focus on President Mohamed Morsi, whose detention now is reaching its 6th year. But in those 6 years, he's had only 3 family visits. The extreme and inhumane conditions of the detention are shocking, not least because of the politically motivated nature of his prosecution and detention. He's held in virtual total solitary confinement and with limited access to medicine. Even the 3 meager visits he's had with his family over 6 years has had security officials present. This case is not getting nearly enough attention that it deserves. I want to focus on also a case in Iran, Niloufar Bayami. She is one of 8 environmental activists who's been jailed in Iran, now facing likely charges of corruption because of her work in an NGO that works to protect endangered species in the environmental crisis that is ongoing in Iran. She's an alumni of McGill and Columbia universities. She should have a natural and strong base of support of people challenging her unjust detention. Again, a case that deserves more focus and attention. Finally, I want to highlight the case of Nasser Zafzafi, a Moroccan activist from the Rif region, who was recently sentenced to a shocking 20 years in prison for participating in protests and with absurd charges of violence for which the government produced no evidence other than relying on a confession that he says was obtained under torture. Morocco gets a pass as being a lone moderate in the Middle East region, but that is no cover for its continued repression against protesters and activists in the country. With that, I'll turn to my colleagues to do a deeper dive on some of the trends in the region. Thank you.
Hello everyone, good to see you this morning. I'm going to talk about Mohammed bin Salman, MBS for short, and the tumultuous year, to say the least, it was for him in 2018. MBS is a very interesting story of a prince that was fairly obscure. Very few people really knew who he was. He was a minor official in the Interior Ministry until the beginning of 2015 when his father became king. And when that happened, he was catapulted from obscurity into leadership positions, and it became very clear that he was soon going to become the heir apparent, which he officially became in mid-2017. Along with his rise, there developed a narrative around him where he was portrayed by legions of management consultants and PR firms as the face of a new generation of Saudi leadership, who was going to face down the economic challenges of the country, wean the country off its dependence on foreign oil, or on oils only, and in fact pursue some social reforms as well, including women's rights reforms. So this was the narrative. I think it's fair to say many people bought into this. If you saw MBS's publicity tour that he did in the UK and in the US, not even a year ago, he met with leading politicians, he met with celebrities, he met with Oprah. There was nobody that was organizing his country. Now, of course, what they didn't tell us, what the PR firms didn't tell us, is that MBS had made the decision early on that in order to pursue his reforms that he wanted to, he felt like he needed to basically institute a reign of terror in the country. He needed to silence all independent voices. He needed to jail all human rights activists. He needed to root out any sort of criticism on Twitter. And in fact, this darker side of his rule only became clearer, I think, for most people after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. So after that happened, I think some of these darker points of MBS's reign became more clear. But I want to talk just a little bit about some of them. I think, obviously, the Khashoggi case has become well known, but I think people don't necessarily understand the sheer number of people who have been arrested under MBS's rule. And we're talking about independent clerics, we're talking about academics, we're talking about others. One such case is the very famous independent cleric Salman al-Auda, who is currently on trial for his life. The prosecutors are seeking the death penalty against him, merely because apparently he refused to support the state's Qatar policy. So that's going on. In addition, he also went after independent businessmen, former and current government officials, as well as royal family members, ostensibly on corruption allegations. Many of these include, in fact, the sons of the late King Abdullah, Turki al-Abdullah, and Metaib, as well as others. And while these people, they were accused of corruption, it turned out that they jailed them in a 5-star hotel and essentially, apparently mistreated them, putting pressure on them to give up assets in exchange for their freedom outside of any recognizable legal process. And some of them, like the sons of Abdullah, remain in detention. We don't know their case statuses. We don't know what's happening with them. It's kind of a black hole. So those are some of the cases. And even worse, even though MBS has presented himself as a reformer on women's rights, in fact, he went after and jailed all of the leading women's rights defenders in the country, starting last May. And they've been in jail now without charge for 6, 7, 8 months. And it's very difficult to see how things are going to go from here, especially after the fact that they have made serious allegations of mistreatment and torture in Saudi detention. So the women have said that they were beaten, that they were whipped, that they were hit with electric shocks, and 1 or 2 have even said that they were subjected to sexual harassment and assault. So, I mean, I think this really paints a picture of where things are in Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman. So, given the repression, I think it's time to go back to the beginning and take a look and say, was it worth it? What reforms did we get out of this? He repressed Saudi society. He silenced independent voices, which he felt he needed to do to institute the reforms. So where are the reforms? In terms of women's rights, other than ending the driving ban, there have not been major changes. The guardianship system is still intact. I think the case of the fleeing Saudi woman last week, Rahaf al-Qunun, really brought that into focus. So there's still a long way to go on women's rights. In addition, even some of the economic reforms are stalled. The IPO for Aramco doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon. In addition, there's been a massive flight of Saudi intellectuals and academics out of the country, which certainly isn't going to help fix the economy. And I think it's very clear to say that some international investors, given the image of MBS right now, are afraid to put their money in the country and are afraid to pull the trigger on investments. So even his investments, to at least some extent, are hampered. So it seems as though there's a really curious situation in which he's engaged in the repression, and the repression itself is playing a role in undermining his own reforms. It'll be interesting to see where things go from here. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So I'm here to talk to you about Yemen. If you've thought about Yemen, if you've written about Yemen, if you've read about Yemen, you've probably heard the phrase, the world's worst humanitarian crisis in the world, many times. It's usually followed by a string of figures. So about 20,000 civilians killed or wounded, maybe tens of thousands more, depending on who's counting. 400,000 children under 5 suffering from severe acute malnutrition. 2 million people displaced, about half of them kids. Nearly half the population at risk of starvation if something doesn't drastically change. The vast majority of the population reliant on some form of aid to survive. Even veteran humanitarian workers have a very difficult time comprehending what those numbers actually mean, what that actually looks like in terms of what we're seeing in Yemen, what they're seeing in Yemen. And normally I'm the type of person who likes facts and figures. For me, if I hear 400,000 children under 5 severely acutely malnourished, I'm energized. I think that's something that needs to be responded to. But in the wake of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, there was a lot of ink spilled about why the murder of this one person, as gruesome as it was, managed to provoke such an international reaction that 4 years of war in Yemen had not. That thousands upon thousands of Yemenis killed and maimed, millions sick and hungry, had not. So today what I'm going to do is talk to you about 2 particular Yemenis, and I'm going to talk about those 2 particular Yemenis because I think their story indicates quite clearly why the crisis that we're seeing in Yemen, it's not a natural disaster, it's not an earthquake, it's something that is in fact man-made. And those 2 Yemenis are a young boy named Ahmed and his father. So the moment I have seared in my memory from talking to Ahmed and his father was when his father said, "until the war came." And the reason that moment, that phrase, is stuck in my memory is because that's the moment when his voice, which had been filled with pride up until that moment, shifted to being filled with sorrow. He had been talking about his son. He was about 12 in the 3rd grade, smart, until the war came. The Saudi-led coalition bombed their home. The Houthi armed group that had terrorized the family for about 2 weeks, refusing to allow them to leave, were left entirely unscathed in the attack, but Ahmed was severely wounded. He had brain damage. The family fled on the western coast, and then fighting reached them again. The father couldn't go back to help them because he needed to stay with his son. The family couldn't go back to their house because they had heard that the Houthis had mined the area. The way in which this story indicates that the crisis is man-made first is because the way in which the warring parties are fighting directly implicates and exacerbates the humanitarian situation. So, if the Saudi-led coalition repeatedly bombs civilian homes, that's going to increase displacement. If the Houthi armed group lays landmines in residential areas, that's going to make it harder for people to return home. Over the last 4 years, we've seen both the Saudi-led coalition and the Houthi armed group repeatedly attack critical civilian infrastructure, ensure that hospitals are shuttered or damaged, hit water wells, all of these things directly exacerbating a situation where people are already sick and hungry. The second way in which Ahmed and his father's story shows for us very clearly that this crisis is man-made is the way in which the warring parties are directly impeding and blocking the delivery of humanitarian aid. So Ahmed needed a surgery that wasn't available in Yemen to actually heal. Even the treatments that he was able to get in Yemen were basically beyond what his father was able to pay. The health system in Yemen has all but collapsed. And there's multiple reasons for this, but one of the two is the very obvious and blatant ways in which we've seen the warring parties block aid. So Yemen's seen things like, if we all recall, the Saudis and the Emiratis shutting down all entry points to the country on famine's doorstep. But it's also seen what I sort of envision more as something that is death by 1,000 cuts. It's harder to explain this, but it's just as brutal in its outcome. So be it the Houthis or Yemeni forces that the coalition are supporting, at each step in the transit process of medicine or aid or fuel, you have warring parties blocking aid, impeding it, stealing it, and at each step that happens, the prices go up and up and up. So while there might be medicine and fuel and food on the shelves, families like Ahmed's can't afford it. The third way in which Ahmed's story and his father's shows that this crisis, again, really is man-made is not just about the people in Yemen, those fighting in Yemen. It's their external backers, the ones supporting them, the ones defending them. And it's the fact that those with leverage haven't been using the leverage that they have to push the parties to end these abuses. So when Ahmed's father went around asking, how can I get help for my son? The Saudi coalition bombed our house. The Houthis had terrorized us and basically locked us up in the house. How can I get help? People said to him, well, the coalition pays for fighters to get treatment abroad, but only fighters. So what about the civilian victims? Where's the redress, the compensation, the accountability? A lot of people, when they hear someone like me say those words, they say, that's something that human rights advocates focus on, but it's not a real thing. It's not a real thing we can expect in the world. But that's not actually true. In the context of Yemen, a redress mechanism, a compensation mechanism, is totally within the realm of the possible. It's just a matter of political will. And for someone like Ahmed, the question of redress could mean the difference between this guy getting the surgery he needs or not. The question of accountability could be the difference between a child thinking of what happened to his family as a senseless tragedy that he can expect, or something that is in fact wrong that can and should be stopped. Now, I want to end just by placing us where we are on Yemen now. About a month ago, you had this honestly incredible moment where there finally was real international pressure on Yemen. And it pushed the warring parties to the table in Sweden. And the warring parties came to agreements on Hudaydah, on Taiz, on detainees. And there was this small glimmer of hope that finally the states that had been backing and supporting and defending the warring parties were actually going to push them an inch closer towards peace. It's been about a month, and that pressure has already faded. So in the last few days, take the detainee agreement. You had families in Yemen who had a countdown waiting for the day that the agreement was supposed to be actualized because they thought that they could finally see their loved ones who have been arbitrarily detained or forcibly disappeared, some for many years. But in the last few days, we've seen the warring parties trade barbs. We've seen that basically going to the point of potentially collapsing. And you haven't seen the international response you would need to make clear to the warring parties that meeting in Sweden in December is not enough. You actually need to actualize the agreements that you made. And so I think the thing I will end with is really, a lot of the times when people come up and they speak about Yemen, we focus on the Saudi-led coalition or we focus on the Houthi armed group or the UAE, and fair enough. But the fact of the matter is there are so many people within Yemen who are pushing for justice and change and peace. And the real question for me remains, when are the states that are currently arming, currently backing those fighting with bombs and bullets going to say, actually, no, we're going to stand with the people of Yemen who are actually pushing for things like rights protection and an end to suffering, and so that the war doesn't keep coming to families like Ahmed? When are they going to stand with them rather than continuing business as usual as it's been for the last 4 years, because we've seen what that brings.
Hello everybody, thank you for being here. We're going to talk about Egypt now. And when it comes to Egypt, well, here goes the PR narrative. In 2011, after the revolution and after Islamists took power a year after quickly, and President Morsi, even though he was elected democratically, well, he attempted a power grab pretty quickly, thus showing his true undemocratic colors. This is how the PR narrative continues. The people realizing that took to the streets pretty quickly, And then the army, the People's Army, the same army who didn't shoot at the people when they were demanding the fall of Mubarak 2 years earlier, well, they heeded the call of the people and they took down President Morsi and the Muslim Brothers, who, by the way, quickly resorted to terrorism. The PR narrative continues. So yes, Sisi is a tough leader, a strong leader, but then we're dealing with terrorism, so it takes a firm hand, doesn't it? End of PR narrative. Well, that PR narrative, the many Western governments seem to buy it, or at least they pretend to buy it, because business as usual has to continue, including significant arms sales. As for the general public in the West, well, it's not about buying the narrative, it's mostly about relativity effect, which strikes as soon as we talk about the Middle East. It can be as bad as Syria, can it? And then, yes, Sisi is a strong man, but aren't all Arab leaders? Well, we in Human Rights Watch have a very different point of view, and according to our investigations and what we've been able to document, well, Egypt today is a full-fledged dictatorship, and it was very clear since the start. You all remember Rabat Square, right? A couple of days after President Morsi was removed, between 800 and 1,000 people were killed in Rabat Square. That is the worst massacre in one day in contemporary history. Let's not forget that. And then, in an incredible feat of cynicism, high-level officials said that everything in Rabat went, quote, according to plan, end quote. One of them even said that they were expecting a higher toll. How cynical is that? So it was very clear since the start, that was the bloody inaugural act of the Sisi presidency. Actually, he wasn't president back then, but then he would become president soon. And we'll demonstrate how ghastly the situation is in 3 points. How the opposition has been obliterated, that how we have gotten to crime against humanity level of oppression, and then how the terrorism pretext is used. So as I said earlier, at the Rabat stage, Sisi wasn't elected president. He was 1 year later in 2014, and then he was re-elected in 2018, both with 70% margin. I mean, anyone who dared announce that he wanted to run for presidency was either arrested, placed under house arrest, had criminal charges thrown on him, had staff members arrested. I mean, we in Human Rights Watch called that farcical. And believe me, we don't use that kind of language easily. Our legal department doesn't let us. But that time, it just went through because that's what it was, farcical. Protesting in Egypt is basically forbidden. There's a law against that. And thousands of people have been arrested for protesting the anti-protest laws. It would be funny if it wasn't tragic. More than 60,000 people have been arrested or prosecuted on political grounds. 19 new jails have been opened under this regime just to manage the unexpected influx of detainees. This is how bad it is. Now the oppression has gotten to a crime against humanity level. Thousands have been disappeared and tortured in Egyptian prisons. We call that the assembly line of torture because it obeys the same protocol always. People are abducted in the street, blindfolded in cars, taken to unknown location that depend on Ministry of the Interior, and then a protocol of torture starts, including beating, shocking with electricity, stress positions, people hang by their wrists to the frame of a door, rape threats, actual rape in some cases. This happens systematically in detention centers, and it happens nationwide, and this is what allowed us to use the term potential crime against humanity. Just think of one scene in the prosecutor's office when those people who have been tortured and confessed under torture are interrogated by the prosecutor. It often happens that police staff keeps on beating them in front of the prosecutor, and the prosecutor doesn't say a word. Or the prosecutor threatens them if they keep on insisting that confessions were tortured out of them, that they would be sent back to the torturers. So the judicial system is ganging up against, with the police against the people. Now, much of this is justified by the need to fight terrorism by the regime. Well, it is true that there are armed groups in northern Sinai that are affiliated with ISIS and that they regularly clash with the army, resulting in hundreds of deaths. Now, how did the army react to that? Well, first, thousands of homes of homes were destroyed. About a city, Rafah, close to the border with Gaza, was almost wiped off the map for security reasons, with improper compensation for the owners of those houses. And then obviously, this kind of handling of a terrorist crisis has a boomerang effect. The resentment against the army rises and rises, and it's not forbidden to think that many people, because of that treatment, will actually think of joining the terrorist groups. So this is not exactly an efficient counter-terrorist strategy. Now, the truth is, terrorism is mostly used in Egypt as a pretext to stifle opposition of whatever kind. We have documented scores of cases of liberal, secular activists who have been accused of belonging to terrorist groups. Blogger Wael Abbas, who is well known, who is a liberal and secular, well, he's been accused of belonging to a terrorist group. Comedian Shadi Abu Zaid, in the anniversary of the revolution, he pulled off a stunt. He inflated condoms and offered them to army members. Well, he was accused of belonging to a terrorist group. Dictatorships have no sense of humor. So this is where Egypt stands right now. It is a full-fledged dictatorship with no room for reform or hope, for that matter. And this is only what we know. And we haven't been allowed into Egypt since 2014. So whatever you think of Egypt, even after this presentation and those ghastly facts and numbers, the reality is probably worse. Thank you.
Hello everyone. I would like to talk to you today about the significant progress that women's rights activists have achieved in recent years in the Middle East and North Africa region. Whether it's Saudi women finally being allowed to drive in 2018, or the hope that Tunisia may become the first Muslim-majority country in the region to ensure gender equality in inheritance laws. The road to reform, however, has not been without challenges. Women's rights activists have faced harassment, intimidation, and imprisonment for their efforts. In 2018, we saw in Saudi Arabia, as the authorities were gearing up to lift the driving ban, they arrested more than a dozen prominent women's rights activists, including Lujaina Al-Hafloul, Imana Nafjan, and Aziz Al-Yusuf. In Egypt, we saw the authorities arrest Amal Fathy after she posted a video criticizing the state for sexual harassment, and she was held for 7 months. Feminist organization heads like Mazen Hassan and Azza Soleiman remain under travel bans in Egypt too. Now, there have been a number of key areas of reforms within the MENA region, but I'm going to focus on 3 key areas. The first is on the repeal of archaic laws relating to rape marriage exoneration laws. The second is on new protections against domestic violence. And the last one is about ending the male guardianship system. So first, there are several countries in the Middle East and North Africa region that kept legal provisions from the colonial era that had allowed rapists to escape prosecution or conviction if they married their victims. But after intense campaigning by women's rights organizations, we are now starting to see an end in sight. So in 2018, we saw Palestine repeal this provision. They followed after Tunisia, Jordan, and Lebanon from the summer of 2017. Morocco repealed theirs in 2014, and Egypt in 1999. However, 6 countries still contain these legal provisions. But we may see an end to that too. This year, we're hoping to see Kuwait, Bahrain, and Iraq, where women's rights organizations have launched similar campaigns. Now, domestic violence is a global phenomenon, and the Middle East and North Africa region is no exception. But this region has for a very long time had the fewest legal protections to curb domestic violence. And even here we are seeing a change. In the past 5 years, 9 countries, almost half of the countries in the Middle East and North Africa region, now have laws to curb domestic violence. The latest was in Morocco in 2018, but their law isn't as comprehensive as Tunisia's was when they passed theirs in 2017. Tunisia allows women to obtain emergency and long-term protection orders against their abusers without filing a criminal complaint or a divorce. Now, this is absolutely crucial. I've met and spoken to women who describe turning up to police stations with blooded noses, bruised bodies, and burnt areas, and found that the police were giving them very little assistance, even when they were demanding immediate protection. This year, we're looking to see Iraq, Kuwait, and Palestine, who are all considering long-awaited bills on domestic violence. Finally, we should look at the male guardianship system, which does exist in various forms across the entire Middle East and North Africa region. But Saudi Arabia has the most draconian and extensive form of male guardianship. Under Saudi Arabia's male guardianship system, women must have a male guardian from birth until death, who can be their father, their brother, their husband, or even their son, to make crucial decisions on their behalf, such as getting married, obtaining a passport, traveling abroad, undertaking higher education, or even exiting prison. Now, you've seen in the last couple of weeks the case of Rahaf al-Qanun, who managed to successfully flee her family. But the truth is that the vast majority of Saudi women are trapped in the kingdom. If they are abused and they flee, they can be arrested and brought back to their family. Or they can remain confined to a shelter until they reconcile, being forced back to the first abusive family anyway. But we are still seeing some small changes come through, even in the male guardianship system. So last week, we saw the health ministry announce that Saudi women will now be able to make crucial decisions about giving birth without requiring male guardian consent, such as, for instance, having a cesarean section. Now, this is a small, tiny step, but it's still crucial for the women in this country. In conclusion, I want to remind you that all of the reforms that we're seeing wouldn't be happening without the bravery of women's rights activists in the MENA region. These women deserve our full support if we are going to see all women be able to live their lives free from discrimination and violence. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. That brings our presentations to an end. I'd like to now invite all of our speakers onto stage, where we hope to host a very quick, or not very quick, we'll have at least half an hour, hopefully, for lots of questions. So yeah, do come on stage and join us for a Q&A. Just a reminder that we are broadcasting live on Facebook and on Al Jazeera. So if you'd like to, if you're watching remotely, and would like to ask questions to any of our experts on anything that they've talked about or things that they didn't, if you put those questions onto our Facebook page of Human Rights Watch, we can address those questions. Thank you.